We're going to spend our time today thinking about a little bit what it looks like to build our lives on the cornerstone, as we just sang in such incredible ways. And we're going to think about some things that Peter calls us to give up in 1 Peter, some things that he calls us to rid ourselves of. And then we're also going to go further and think about some things that he calls us to embrace. What we're going to see today is that he is not just calling us to give something up, but to embrace something else. And so we're going to turn together and we're going to see this out of 1 Peter chapter 2. So if you want, you can open up with me to 1 Peter chapter 2. And as you're turning there, I'll note that 1 Peter is actually a really interesting book of the Bible from just like a purely textual point of view. In the first, what we see in the chapter 1, right, is that Peter actually addresses this letter to a group of churches. In the first verse, it says, Peter, an apostle of Jesus Christ, to God's elect, exiles scattered throughout the provinces of Pontus, Galatia, Cappadocia, Asia, and Bithynia. And it's a strong contrast to most of Paul's letters, right? We're also familiar with Paul's epistles, where he writes mostly to one church in one city, in one place. But Peter writes this letter to a community. He writes this letter to a wider reach of churches, and he says, this is for you. And that's one thing. The other thing that's really interesting about this letter in general is that Peter puts an incredible focus on evangelism. He puts an incredible focus on what it means to share the gospel, to share the good news of Jesus with those around us. But interestingly, again, in a contrast to most of Paul's letters, Peter does it not by focusing on theology. Right? If you grew up in the church like me, you're probably used to the idea, if you're going to evangelize, you're going to walk someone through the Romans road. You're going to lead someone through the 5 verses in the book of Romans that are theologically rich. They're verses that are theologically powerful, and you can lead someone to Jesus that way. But what's so interesting about 1 Peter is that in the letter, Peter doesn't give us all that much theological depth when it comes to evangelism. Instead, what he gives us is a deep concern for the way that our lives look, for what our lives are like, and the way that our choices and our actions are evangelism in and of themselves. And so today in chapter 2, we're going to see that theme start to get formed that kind of flows out into the rest of the letter. And so we're in 1 Peter chapter 2, starting in verse 1. It says this. It says, therefore, rid yourselves of all malice and all deceit, hypocrisy, envy, and slander of every kind. Like newborn babies, crave pure spiritual milk so that by it you may grow up in your salvation, now that you have tasted that the Lord is good. As you come to him, the living stone, rejected by humans, but chosen by God and precious to him, you also, like living stones, are being built into a spiritual house to be a holy priesthood, offering spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God through Jesus Christ. For in Scripture it says, see, I lay a stone in Zion, a chosen and precious cornerstone, and the one who trusts in him will never be put to shame. Now to you who believe the stone is precious, but to those who do not believe, the stone the builders rejected has become the cornerstone, and a stone that causes people to stumble, and a rock that makes them fall. They stumble because they disobey the message, which is also what they were destined for. And we should note that just because 1 Peter might not be of the same sort of theological richness, like a rich theological text, doesn't mean that it's not rich in its own way. And Peter gives us a beautiful image here of what God's spiritual house is like, a house built out of living stones, made up of people who have embraced the life that Jesus has called them to. But before we get to building up the spiritual house, Peter requires something first of us, right? In verse 1, he says, rid yourselves of all malice and all deceit, hypocrisy, envy, and slander of every kind. If we're going to be built into God's spiritual house, if we're going to build up God's spiritual house around us, then what we're going to see is that we're going to have to release the things that hinder and embrace the one who was rejected. We're going to have to release the things that hinder us, and we're going to have to embrace the one who was rejected. And here I think in so many ways is the beauty of 1 Peter, because it calls us to give up things like malice and deceit and hypocrisy and envy and slander. And it challenges us to do that for our own benefit. It's better for us to give these things up. But First Peter also challenges us to do it for the benefit of others, for the benefit of God's spiritual house, for the benefit of our kids, of our families, of our friendships, of our community. Peter notes, obviously, right, these things, they hinder our growth in Jesus, our own growth in Jesus. He contrasts them with the pure spiritual milk that helps us grow up in our salvation. And if you take in the opposite of pure spiritual milk, if you take in the opposite of this pure spiritual milk, you can't grow, right? It's like Brondo. If you put Brondo on the plants, it doesn't make the plants grow. It doesn't matter how much of it you use. If you take in something other than spiritual milk, it will prevent you from growing up in your salvation. But on top of this, we see that when we do not rid ourselves of these things, when we hold on to these things, they hinder the building up of God's spiritual house. They hinder the building up of God's spiritual house. And I think we all know this, right? A house is not just one brick and one cornerstone, and you just like pop it on there, right? If you think that that is a house, I have a house in Fountain Valley right now worth $600,000 to sell you, okay? The reality is a house is a building made up of many bricks, built on one foundation. And so if we're going to build up, if we're going to be part of building up God's spiritual house, then we're going to need more bricks. We're going to need more living stones. And the way to accomplish that is certainly not by holding on to malice and deceit and hypocrisy and envy and slander. And I think it's really interesting that Peter gives us these 5 things as the things to rid ourselves of. There are 5 things that have to do with the way we interact with others. Peter could have given us a ton of different sins, right? Go read Paul's epistles. He has vice lists that go so long you're thinking, wow, I didn't even think about that one. Or wow, I cannot believe Paul actually had to tell someone that that was sin. And yet Peter just gives us 5 relatively simple things that focus on the way that we interact with other people. And we all come to Jesus holding on to these things. And oftentimes, if we're being honest with ourselves, we come to Jesus and we still hold on to these things. That's why Peter says there's still growing up to do in our salvation. There's still work to be done for us. But we can think of our coming to Jesus with these things sort of in the sense of kind of a standoff, like the standoff at the OK Corral, okay? So I'm probably one of 6 people under 30 who love Western movies, okay? And I cannot get enough of Westerns. And we can all imagine the scene probably, right, where everyone's kind of standing there, they've got their guns drawn, and I'm pointing at this guy, and he's pointing, and so on and so forth, and we're all aiming at each other. And you've probably, if you don't know what I'm talking about, you've probably seen the episode of The Office where they reenact this, but we didn't use it because I don't want to get us a copyright violation. And so I imagine for a second that we've got our guns drawn, right? And we've got malice and we've got deceit. And I've got 2 hands, so imagine everything else is there too. And we're pointing our guns at each other. And what Peter is inviting us into is to say, just lower your guns for a second, right? Don't do the like fake out thing that Michael Scott does. Just actually lower your guns for a second. And just from a purely practical standpoint, think for a second about how much better your life would be. How much better your experiences with people would be. Just from a purely practical perspective, if everyone lowered the guns of malice and deceit, of hypocrisy, of envy, of slander, if in this community we could say, oh, I don't have to worry about my brother or my sister in Christ using one of those against me. So rid yourself of those things. They hinder your growth. They hinder my growth. They hinder the building up of God's spiritual house. Get rid of them. But Peter doesn't stop there, because the challenge is not simply to release the things that hinder, but we have to embrace something else. Peter doesn't want us to just lower our guns and that's it, it's over, it's done with. Right? You could get rid of, if you were an everyday person who got rid of all malice and deceit and hypocrisy and envy and slander, you would be a fantastic person. We would all want to hang out with you. That just sounds like a great person. But that's not what Peter is calling us to. He's not calling us to just be great people. He's calling us to embrace Jesus. In verse 4, he says, as you come to him, the living stone. If you just rid yourself of these things and then you don't come to Jesus, you've missed the point. You've missed out on what Jesus has for us. The point isn't to be a great person. It's to build ourselves into God's spiritual house. It's to build up God's spiritual house around us. But most importantly, the foundation of that spiritual house has to be Jesus. The foundation, the cornerstone, cannot be anything other than Jesus. And so our lives and the spiritual house we find ourselves in have to be built on the cornerstone, on the stone that the builders rejected. Otherwise, the whole thing is faulty. In Matthew 7, Jesus tells the parable of the wise and foolish builders, right? Where the wise man builds his house on the rock and the foolish man builds his house on the sand, and the rains came down and the floods came up. And Amy's probably happy because I remember that song from kids ministry that we sang every week. But it's a great parable to think about what it looks like to put our life, our house on the right foundation. If we choose the wrong foundation, everything else is at risk. Everything else we build on top of it is faulty. And the challenge here lies in verse 8 of 1 Peter chapter 2, because in 1 Peter 2, verse 8, it says this. It says that Jesus is a stone that causes people to stumble and a rock that makes them fall. Building your foundation on Jesus can be challenging. In fact, it's hard because Jesus' call on our life is challenging. And it can be tempting for us to decide we're going to build our foundation because it's so hard, because Jesus demands so much of us. I'm going to build my foundation. I'm going to build my house on something that's like Jesus, on something that's close enough to Jesus. That's pretty close. But Peter says that is not enough. He says your cornerstone has to be Jesus. And being a few degrees off can change everything. Last spring, I went down to the Mexico trip to participate in building a new kind of Christian education building attached to a church down there in Mexico. And you can just imagine it was a building attached to a main church building, kind of like the lighthouse here behind us, except it had 2 stories. And someone thought it was a good idea for us to build the 2nd story. And so we get down there, and I hadn't been on one of these Mexico trips since I was in high school, I think. And if I'm being honest, as a high school student, I was a useless participant in these trips. I mostly hung out with kids, and I sang songs that I still remember. I could sing the I May Never March with the Infantry, all in Spanish right now, but I won't do it, I promise, just for each of you. But we went down there this time, and as an adult, I said, I'm going to be helpful. I'm going to work hard, and I know everyone else down here, except for the other high school students, they all work in the trades. They work in construction, or they do things like this. I'm the one person down here right now who has no clue what they're doing. And so, but I'm just going to work hard, and we're going to see what happens. And so at some point when we were down there, it came time to put the facade on the 2nd story of this building. And so suddenly out of nowhere, John Roberts, if you know John, he was a firefighter for years. He worked in construction. He's basically everything you want from someone on one of these trips. So I thought, I'll just do whatever John does. And so John starts getting out all the equipment to put scaffolding up to the second story. And so I start helping him, and we're putting kind of the steps up, linking it together, climbing up, putting the steps up, climbing up, putting the steps up. And next thing I realize, I'm at the top. Let me demonstrate here for a second. I didn't pre-check this with Alex. I'm probably not supposed to get off the stage at this point, but you know what? Okay. So I realize I'm standing up high, okay? I feel like I'm 60 feet up in the air. Reality is probably was like 15 feet, but I'm not good with heights in general. So I'm standing on this scaffolding. I'm up here. We're what feels like certain death high enough off the ground right now with a slightly wobbly scaffolding. I'm standing up there with John and a guy named Eric Bruner, who was much braver than I was this whole time. And I'm holding on for dear life. And then I turn around thinking, I've done my job. I've assembled the scaffolding. What more could I need? And as I'm standing there, I turn around to climb down. And as I do, people start handing pieces of plywood up to us. And I suddenly realized I had not volunteered to assemble a scaffold. I'd volunteered to do the actual work of putting this building together on the outside of it. Me and these two other guys who looked like they knew way more what they were doing. And so we start measuring kind of to figure out where everything's at. The roof is at a slant. Everything is going well enough at the start because I'm not doing anything. And then eventually it becomes my turn to measure something, and I'm kind of like, I'm doing it with one hand, trying to hook the measuring tape and pull it down because I don't want to let go of the pole, and I'm like shaking like this, and literally people are on the ground mocking me while I'm doing it. It was great. And so we kind of eyeball it, get it there, and the last piece of the scaffolding comes, and we realize we can't reach the edge of the building. And so we have to actually get off the scaffold. We have to put a ladder on the shack that was next to this building, kind of a shack with a flat roof that was not super stable looking, if I'm being honest. We put a ladder on it, and I'm standing behind it, holding Eric as he climbs up the ladder to measure and make sure we get this right. And on the other side of us, this I'm certain of, it was at least a 25-foot drop from there because there's a hill we're on. And so here I am holding the ladder, holding Eric's shirt. Eric's climbing up higher. There's an abyss next to me. And Eric is hanging off the edge. And all I can think about the whole time is, I know your wife. I know your son. Your daughter's with us here on this trip. I cannot let you die right now. And Eric's stretching and the ladder's like shaking. And I'm shaking as the ladder starts shaking. And he kind of gets it and he yells out some measurements and he goes, I think. And I said, that's good enough. And I pull him down, we get down, we climb down, they pass the thing up, we nail it up. And as we nail it up, I'm looking at it going, oh my gosh. And I think we've got a photo here. This is what good enough got us. Now you can see, if you see there's a corner there, you can see those pieces are not aligned at all. And here's the deal. From there, I thought, this is basically my view when we took a picture, I thought, okay, that's gonna be okay because no one's gonna notice that from the ground. I mean, think about that. We're 25 feet in the air in my mind. No one's gonna notice that from the ground. And the moment we get down, someone goes, wow, who messed up the front of the church? All because we decided good enough was gonna cut it for us. And the sad thing was that on the whole car ride home, we got made fun of. I got a text message like 2 weeks after the trip that was just a random photo, this photo, in fact, of the building. Just no comment, just the photo, just to remind me of my failure in the moment. But it all came from the fact that we were okay with good enough. When it comes to our foundation, we can't hear the question, is your foundation built on Jesus, and say, it's good enough. But good enough would be a lot easier. That good enough isn't what we've been called to. We're called to make our cornerstone, our foundation, Jesus. A few inches off, and you haven't built yourself into God's spiritual house. You've built yourself into something else. A few inches off, and you're not building up God's spiritual house. You're building up something else. And as we know, it's hard enough to make Jesus your cornerstone. He is a stumbling block for many. He is a stone, a rock that makes them fall. His teachings are difficult. Making Jesus your cornerstone is difficult because his teachings are challenging. His call on our lives is all-encompassing. Take some time to read the Sermon on the Mount, right? Matthew 5-7, and tell me that all of those things are easy to live out. That it's easy to live out all the teachings that Jesus calls us to. Don't swear an oath at all. If someone strikes you on the left cheek, offer them your right. If anyone asks of you, give to them. That's just 3 of 3 whole chapters worth of stuff. There's a former baseball player who tweeted the other day that I saw, and he tweeted saying that he doesn't follow a meek and mild Jesus. He says, I follow a bold, strong, and courageous Jesus. And here's something that stood out to me when he said it, is that very week I was preparing a message for our high school students on Jesus saying in Matthew 5, blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. And it struck me that in so many ways, meekness doesn't fit our paradigm. It doesn't fit the things we value in this world. It doesn't fit the things that are important to us. It doesn't fit the things that we spend years training our athletes towards. And it should be no surprise then that in reality what he was saying was, I've found something that's good enough. It's close enough to Jesus. But the reality is he'd missed it by just a few inches. He'd missed it by that much. It's hard for us to make Jesus our cornerstone. And luckily for us, there's no expectation that we get it right away. That's why Peter notes, right, even that there's growing up to be done in our salvation. It's not like we had one moment where we came and we gave our life to Jesus and boom, we've got to have everything figured out. We've got to have our life 100% built on the cornerstone and from that day forward, not diverge in any sort of way. But our response to that grace cannot to say, well, it's good enough. I think it's good enough because the moment we do that, we have stopped being built into God's spiritual house and we have started to be built into something else. Once we say good enough, what we're doing is we are adding our own stumbling block before Jesus. And that's what 1 Peter to me is deeply worried about, that we would place a stumbling block in the path of others, that we in our choices and our actions would prevent others from having an opportunity to see Jesus for who he really is. That's why if we don't rid ourselves of malice and deceit and hypocrisy and envy and slander, then those things become stumbling blocks for others around us. If we say good enough and we allow our lives to be built on a foundation that is different than Jesus, then we'll end up putting all sorts of stumbling blocks in the way of others. And we cannot add another stumbling block before Jesus. Jesus is already enough of a stumbling block on his own for many, many people. We cannot allow our own baggage and our own shortcomings, our own ideas, to then cause others to stumble too. And that means that we have to do the hard work of continually looking at our lives and seeing if our foundation is Jesus or if our foundation is good enough. And we have to take the time to ask ourselves then, what stumbling blocks am I placing in the path of others' pursuit of Jesus? What stumbling blocks am I putting in the way that prevent other people from seeing Jesus? I think we love to think of our faith and our life with Jesus is an individual effort. It's something that I do, and it involves my work. It's about my salvation and my restoration and my fitting into God's bigger story. And that is true. It does involve those things. We think about sin is about my falling short and its impact on me. But First Peter regularly invites us to something bigger than that, to see our choices and our actions as having less to do with ourselves and more to do with something bigger. And so the invitation to rid yourself of these stumbling blocks is an invitation into something bigger. Verse 1 of this chapter started with therefore. And you know that if you see a therefore, then you know Bill's going to make a cheesy joke and he's going to say, what's the therefore? And so we're going to go back and we're going to look at the end of chapter 1. It says this in verse 24. It says, for all people are like grass, and all their glory is like the flowers of the field. The grass withers and the flowers fall, but the word of the Lord endures forever. And this is the word that was preached to you. Therefore, rid yourselves. And Peter goes on. All people are like grass, and their glory is like the flowers of the field. And they're going to wither and fall, but the word of the Lord endures forever. God's spiritual house remains. And the entire invitation here at the start of chapter 2 is an invitation to be part of something bigger, something lasting, something permanent, to be part of something corporate. In verse 9, he closes this section and he says this, he says, but you are a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, God's special possession, that you may declare the praises of him who called you out of darkness into his wonderful light. Once you were not a people, but now you are the people of God. Once you had not received mercy, but now you have received mercy. We are together a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation. And the truth is, we don't have a choice about that. That's just Peter telling us who we are. What we have a choice about is whether we will let these truths by God's grace shape us into the best version of what God says we already are. As chosen people, we can choose, like a spoiled child, to neglect our responsibilities, to count on our special treatment, or we can translate our blessings into selfless service. As a royal priesthood, we can, like a tyrant of a far-off nation, take advantage of our position for personal gain, or we can put our calling to work, leading others around us. As a holy nation, we can, like the nation of Israel in the desert, break into these self-preserving factions that are going to squabble and are going to fight and are going to ignore the things that are going on around them. Or we can heed the resounding call from Jesus in our lives to be a unified community of prayerful love. But make no mistake, we are a chosen people. We are a royal priesthood. We are a holy nation. And whether we live up to that is up to us. We can choose to hold on to malice and deceit and hypocrisy and slander and envy. We can choose to say good enough and place new stumbling blocks in others' paths toward Jesus. We can choose to think only about ourselves and our own discomfort and our own needs and our own security and our own well-being. Or we can choose to release the things that hinder and embrace the one who was rejected. We can choose to live up to our call as chosen people, as a royal priesthood, as a holy nation. We can choose to build up our lives on the cornerstone, not on something that's good enough, not on something that's like Jesus, but on Jesus himself. And say, I am willing to surrender it all, whatever I need to rid myself of, Whatever in my life is preventing me from being built up on the cornerstone, whatever I'm saying good enough about, I will get rid of it. I will surrender it all to the one who by his grace and by his mercy made us into God's special possession. And so I want to just invite you to take a minute today. It'll probably take longer than a minute, but just take a minute right now. And reflect on if you are ready to release the things that hinder and embrace the one who was rejected. If you're ready to give your whole life over to Jesus and build your life on the cornerstone. Just search your life and say, what in my life am I saying good enough about? And then to decide if you're ready to give that up, to surrender it all, to live up to who God says we are. So take a minute.